Hello, everyone. This is Micah Bellew with Fluency Corp, and this is our Global Leaders Conversation. And today I am here with Suzanne Ghais. How are you, Suzanne?
Doing great, thanks. How are you, Micah?
I'm very good today. We were just talking about how here in Dallas, it's already going to hit 90 today. And then Suzanne made me jealous by saying she is in Denver or near Denver.
Yes.
So, in Denver, right around now, do you get nice 75?
Oh, it's been absolutely gorgeous. And we've been getting a good amount of rain this year, which has been much needed. But it rains for a little while in the afternoon and then the sun comes back out and it's usually sunny in the morning. So it's fabulous here this time of year. Don't want to rub it in, but
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to get Colorado on the schedule for July. So right as it hits 100 and something here, I'm like, peace out. Yeah, I'm out of here. Um, so tell me a little bit about either Ghais mediation and facilitation or Pathfinders for Peace. What would you like to chat with us about first?
Yeah, well, Ghais mediation and facilitation was founded longer ago. So I'll start there chronologically. I have been doing conflict resolution related things since I first got out of college.
Wow.
So I had some different jobs. I was for 10 years in an organization in Boulder, Colorado, which is what brought me here to Colorado from
Okay.
the Washington, D.C. area. And I've always aspired to be involved in peace processes, but I started small. I did volunteer community mediation. I did consumer business mediation and arbitration related things in my first real job. And once I got hired at the organization in Boulder, I was doing somewhat larger scale things. So um, issues within organizations that involved groups or between groups. And I still do that work. So that's a lot of what I do through Ghais mediation and facilitation. And I also used to do environmental conflict resolution or consensus building, which is complex and a lot of fun in some ways, but I actually just feel more effective in the organizational realm. So that's what I've really focused on in my business. So that's the business side.
So I have a question that is not on our list, but I mean, little girl, were you thinking, yes, I want to mediate? Like, where did this come from? Like,
Yeah,
that's
and
fascinating.
now it's a sort of well-known field, but when I was
Yes.
in college in the late 80s, I had no idea.
Yeah.
And actually, I did have an experience in college that exposed me to conflict resolution, which was so I'm of Middle Eastern background, and I was part of the Association of Middle Eastern Students. And one of my classmates in that group, uh, keep in mind that group had a lot of people who were pretty directly impacted by the Arab-Israeli conflict. And there was a Campus Israel coalition, and there were sporadic attempts at dialogue between the two groups, which tended not to go very well. But this
Mm.
one classmate, a Palestinian, had the idea of, well, what if we really structured an encounter to really be constructive, and so we put a group together, a joint group of people from both the student groups, and we did some research on conflict resolution and how to do it better. So we held a dialogue that was actually not just a kind of yelling at each other fest. And even then, I still didn't really get that it was a profession. But I had an international relations class with a professor who was very interested in conflict resolution, and he talked about some of that in the class. And so after I graduated, I was like, what am I going to do with my life? I
Of
had no
course.
idea.
Yeah.
And I just decided, well, I want to, let me call him. The professor is Terry Hopman. And the funny thing is that almost 25, I think, years later, I had him serve on my doctoral dissertation committee. So it
Ah,
kind of came
cool.
full circle. So anyways, I called Dr. Hopman and said, like, that stuff you talked about, I want more of, where do I get more of that?
Yeah.
And
You're like, I
he,
liked that experience and I
yeah,
like what you're saying. Yeah. How do I
right.
find that?
Yeah, exactly. So he gave me a couple of names of people to talk to, and each of them gave me more names. And, it's just networking. It's like, wow, that's a field. So at that point, I decided I will take any job I can get in the field of conflict resolution or its, closely connected sister field, ADR, alternative dispute resolution. And so I just went around Washington, D.C., talking to everybody, every single organization I could find, and saying, I'm willing to be an intern, willing to be a secretary, which we now call administrative assistant. But I actually did get a professional job, entry-level job at the Council of Better Business Bureaus, which at the time had an ADR division for consumer disputes.
Oh, amazing. And I think, the DC area is definitely probably one of the better places if this is what you want to do. It's not a huge thing that I hear about. Can you remember one of the first ones that you were either in charge of or working on?
Like a mediation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Well, I did my first actual mediations as a volunteer at the Washington, D.C. Mediation Service. And oh my goodness. A lot of them were the classic neighbor disputes about, trees overhanging or barking dogs or things like that. Small businesses. There's not one that stands out.
That's okay. I can't. Yeah. So
I will say
high
this.
stakes.
Well, not high stakes monetarily. And it's really interesting. The legal profession views these kinds of things as low stakes because nobody's suing for millions of dollars or something like that. But the emotion level and these kind of things can be incredibly intense. I mean, those mediations were as challenging as anything that I've done in my career. It's incredibly valuable training ground for anybody who wants to get into mediation or conflict resolution. I strongly recommend doing community mediation. Yeah, you might have to do it as a volunteer or for a $30 stipend or something, but it is such incredibly challenging and valuable experience. I mean,
I can imagine.
Really
the practice in that.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And so did you take classes to kind of know the tactics? Is that in college? Is it in?
Well, now you can find these things in college, but at the time, as I said, this was such a new field and I didn't discover it till after college. But there's two routes, broadly speaking, and I did both. So one is to take training courses. So a standard mediation training is 40 hours, sometimes 30 hours. And I took one just that I heard about in Virginia, I had to drive a couple hours. But then once the DC Mediation Service was looking for volunteer mediators, they offered a 40-hour training for their mediators. So I took that. And somewhere along the way, I feel like I did another one. But anyway, then a couple years later, I started a graduate program. And so that's the other route, which is a master's program. And now you can do undergraduate in some places, but there are a lot of master's programs, and they're kind of a range from, on the one hand, you have alternative dispute resolution degrees that are often in law schools. And then at the other end of the spectrum would be the peace studies program, programs, peace building, or it might be called peace and conflict. And then I was sort of right in the middle, which was I went to George Mason University and what was then called the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. It's now called the Carter School. So it kind of spanned the gamut. It was, mediation skills and some of that practical stuff that ADR programs do, mediation and facilitation skills, I should say, as well as some of the bigger picture about, deep-rooted societal conflict, but both internationally and at home. So it covered really the gamut. It was great. I loved it.
That is so cool. In another life, that just sounds like something I would totally go for. Absolutely. And it sounds like we've been watching the same TV show. I see that you wrote that you started watching The Diplomat.
Yes, I love
Netflix. I binged it real fast. My partner did as well. And so tell us your I actually even read an article in like the New York Times about diplomats talking about the show. So
Oh,
tell
great.
me your
I haven't.
thoughts on it.
I haven't read that, and I've never been an actual diplomat. It's funny because when at that same point in time after I finished college and was wondering what to do,
Yeah,
my mother was like, "You're so diplomatic. Why don't you go into the State Department?" And
yeah, yeah.
gosh, at that time, I had and kind of still do have so many problems with U.S. foreign policy, and I just couldn't be the face of America's role in the world. Sometimes
Yeah.
I've learned since we are actually really good players in the world, and
Hmm.
we have a lot to offer. But there have been enough instances where I think our militarism has gone too far, or we've sided with the wrong people, and so I just couldn't do that. So I don't honestly know how much the show differs from the life of a real diplomat. I mean, obviously they make it super dramatic, just
Yeah.
like Grey's Anatomy is a really dramatic version of
Fast,
being a
tense.
surgeon.
Yeah.
Yeah. But at the same time, I think they're getting a fair amount right about the current global issues. And although it's fictitious, they refer to a lot of real world things that have happened. I mean, the Russian invasion of
Yeah.
Ukraine and
Yeah.
tensions with Iran and all of that. So I'm enjoying it a great deal.
Yeah, I think mentioning those real life things happening is what is keeping me, yeah, even more interested. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
because I can see how it's talked about and the complexities. God, so complex. So, all right. Tell me a little bit. It says that you've studied and written about peace negotiations.
Yeah.
How do they differ from a more day to day negotiation or conflict resolution process for people like us, people in the workplace? Because most of us listening are not having a dispute country to country. Yeah.
Right, right, right. Well, first, on the one hand, I want to say that it's all been a continuum for me in my career, from those neighbor cases that I did in the early 90s to the peace processes that I, went back to school to study about 10 years ago, 12 years ago.
Yeah.
So a lot of it is just, it's human beings, and the things that happen in conflict happen at any level in terms of like cognitive biases that set in, and emotions, and how our identities get wrapped up in it, and we tend to demonize the other side, and all of that. So in one sense it is all the same, but of course in a deep-rooted societal conflict, and particularly one that's turned violent, there are a lot of additional layers. So just to name a few, I mean, the distrust is extraordinarily high. And typically societies have become polarized if they're experiencing armed conflict. And so it's, hey, you're with us or you're against us. And so there's a lot, most armed conflict these days, Russia and Ukraine being the major exception right now,
Yeah.
most armed conflicts are internal to a country. So they're civil wars or insurgencies. And so in an insurgency, it's really hard for forces to know who's the enemy on the insurgent side. And so there's a lot of um, uh, utilizing human intelligence, recruiting people to basically, collaborate, spy on their neighbors, or share what's going on.
Yeah.
And so the distrust is extraordinarily high. So it just makes it really hard to even get talks started.
Yeah.
And then you have the question of legitimacy of not particularly around non-state actors. So if it's a civil war, governments tend to be very reluctant to negotiate with a non-state actor. It's like lowering themselves. They feel like it's not,
Who are you?
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, in these countries, the government is lacking some legitimacy too. Otherwise, there wouldn't be an armed movement to try to overthrow them or get independence or whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
So the legitimacy questions are really tough. And questions around publicity. Of course, I dealt with some of this when I did environmental issues. Negotiations are a lot easier when there's not an audience. Okay, so if there's an audience,
Yeah.
people tend to speechify and try to sway the audience rather than getting down to brass tacks of like, okay, how do we solve these problems?
More of a show.
Yes. And so so having talks be held in secret allows people to sort of play with ideas that they wouldn't publicly be willing to say yet, okay, we're willing to do this.
Yeah.
And it allows people to explain, what's the real issue? What are the real constraints? What are the internal dynamics on my side that make it hard for me to do this? What are our publics saying? What is my boss, the president, saying, or whatever? So confidentiality is really important, but then at some point in time, and it's really difficult to say when, if you don't get the publics, if you don't begin to condition publics about what concessions will be necessary to make peace, then you can end up with a peace agreement that everybody rejects, and in the extreme case, you have the example of Yitzhak Rabin being assassinated in Israel for his role in the Oslo Accords and the peace process that was going on in that time. So, presidents can get voted out, leaders can get killed or ostracized, and peace agreements can just simply fall apart and the conflict resumes. It is the most common scenario. So peace processes often go through many iterations of trying and failing, trial and error. And while it may sound like, well, isn't that insanity to try the same thing over and over? It's never exactly the same. People typically do learn and do something a little different the next time. So sometimes they ultimately do succeed in terms of sustainably halting the violence and hopefully doing more than that, which is addressing the underlying sources of conflict, the governance issues or the economic inequality issues or whatever it might be, often several.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that inequality or anything else that we might see in the workplace. So for, I haven't worked in a traditional office for over a decade, but it still arises. Conflict still arises. And especially if we are, having Zoom meetings and they're a different culture and we're using our second, third, or fourth language.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot going on there. So tell me about conflicts that you see in the workplace. It could be non-international. It could be Texas to Dallas or Denver to Denver. But if you can talk afterwards on anything specific to international and multicultural for our global audience, I would love that.
Yeah, you bet. So workplace conflicts are often about respect and or communication and or trust. So these are the themes that tend to thread through a lot of conflicts. But beyond that, they can, kind of in terms of the surface issues, they can be about all kinds of things. And I've dealt with conflicts just between individuals who have to interact, or sometimes between a group of people and their manager or their management, maybe more broadly. I've dealt with conflicts where it's tension between some sort of headquarters or central office and the local, regional, branch offices. That's a big one. That's very, very common for the central office to want some degree of standardization and uniformity across the field offices, and the field offices wanting their autonomy and the ability to adapt to local circumstances. So that's, kind of a built-in tension. So, and since the pandemic, there have been conflicts about the pandemic, about, do you really have to get vaccinated, or, how come that person gets to work from home and I don't? Or, the application of policies, are they being applied fairly? So much conflict has come from the pandemic. It's sadly been very, very good for my business.
And random question, but I mean, the goal of the mediation, I mean, I'm just thinking about relationships, family. Like the goal isn't, is it just to validate what the other person is saying? Is it to, I mean, to help one person understand the other? Can you give me a concrete
Yeah.
example? Obviously, you don't have to name the company, just what the maybe the topic was and what they hope to get out of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, mediation can have all kinds of different goals depending on the needs of the people involved.
Mm,
And so, what I try to do is really bend and adapt to what the parties need. So, in some cases, someone just really wants to be heard and understood.
yeah.
And and a lot of the work that I do, because bear in mind, I do mediation and facilitation, and a lot of the work I do is kind of in the gray area between the two, where it's, I'm not, um, the main thing that I offer is a process and a kind of container for the parties, the people involved to work things out. So I don't impose solutions. I don't twist anyone's arm. That is an approach to mediation, which is used in some settings. But I tend to find, I tend to believe if there's an ongoing relationship, you really need to let the parties take the lead on the substance of the
Mm,
outcome. Um, so, so what's the goal? If it's just a better workplace relationship, the one of the difficulties is how much do you talk about the past, right, versus the future. And what I find is that for the most part, it is useful to talk about, okay, what's brought us to this point. Let's walk through those incidents, where you were shouting at me at a meeting, or you said, this person said something or there's been a pattern of how she's talked to me that feels disrespectful, or things like that. So it's important to hear both or all parties' recollections of those events and how they were impacted. So for a chance to clear the air about how did this feel. Now,
yeah.
that said, you can still end up with differences in interpretation or memory of what was said or how it was said or what was done that may never be reconciled. And at that point, you have to say, okay, well, we've gone as far as we can with this. So now let's focus on how do you want to interact moving forward and coming up with guidelines for that.
What are some themes of conflicts that you've seen at work? And then after that, I'll kind of ask you what tips you can give us on how to deal with those. But I am just curious, yeah, over the last um, 2 years, what
Mm-hmm.
are seems to be some themes?
Oh gosh. So let's see. In the last couple of years, some examples
I
of
love,
what I've
yeah,
done.
examples
Yeah.
and stories. I love.
I worked with a nonprofit where that was pretty new and growing fast. And so the board chair and the executive director, the top staff person,
Yeah.
had conflict about kind of what were their respective roles. Because
Mm,
at the beginning, it was the board doing the active work. And so the executive director was initially just kind of the holding down the fort, but increasingly took, leadership roles. But they needed to get their expectations in alignment.
yeah. So
Um,
really clear definitions of defining the roles because they were changing and it was hard to keep up with it. But there needs to be a check-in point of like, this is what I'm in charge of. This is what you're in charge of. Yeah.
exactly.
Lessen the conflict of us running
Right.
into each other.
Right. I've been working for several months at a federal facility where there are like craftsmen workers, and a long history of pretty bad conflict between the workforce generally and the management,
Hmm.
and particularly the facility manager. And there was, a lot of blame of him among the staff, but I think it wasn't all him. I mean, he definitely had some areas where he needed to work
What
on.
kind of
And
issues?
well, so some of it was application of pandemic rules.
Hmm.
And it's how come this person got to have 5 paid days off because they tested positive, when then I couldn't take time off when my spouse got sick. I mean, just things about uneven application of the rules, but in an atmosphere where there had already been some tension and distrust.
Yeah.
And it was just a lot of looking around of, okay, am I getting a raw deal here? Am I getting the same deal as the next person is? There was, in that setting, a lot of pushback against getting vaccinated. And I might add that politics is seeping into the workplace more than I have seen, like in the last few years, not just pandemic era, but building up, the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years. I'm seeing more politics seep in. And I think in part it's social media that is exacerbating that people are getting kind of stuck into a particular point of view, often reinforced by online interactions that they have. And we all know how social media platforms tend to feed you more of the point of view that you are already listening to or reading or seeing.
The algorithms.
So it's funny because so we've got that federal facility I was just talking about where some people were extremely adamant that they shouldn't have to get vaccinated. This is a federal facility. I mean, those rules are made very high up, way outside of the particular workplace. But they thought, well, our boss should advocate for us to get exemptions and things. And, when in fact he actually had very narrow grounds for doing that. It's like religious exemptions or that's it. And then I've got a mirror image situation at another organization I'm working with, which is a university, where when the university, I guess in like fall 2021, announced, okay, everybody's got to come back and work in person. And this was it's a particular department I'm working with, and it's a pretty left-leaning group of people. And so it was the mirror image. They were furious that they were required to come back to campus and interact in person, and where they were arguing that they were being endangered. And there again, why can't our department chairs, deans, et cetera, do something about this when in fact the decisions were made at higher levels and based on CDC guidance and all of that stuff. So those are a couple of examples, but I think in both cases, it's in the one case you had people who were politically on the right saying, why should I have to get vaccinated? And then on the other hand, you had people on the left saying, why should I have to come back to work in person? And I think in both cases, I think their opinions were being pushed to one side or the other, probably through their social media, but also just their political choice of friends, I suppose,
so
or
what
environment.
Helps those kinds of situations? I mean, those are really big questions. This is not a small conflict at work. Like, not that the other one was smaller, but defining the two jobs with the board member that you were talking about with the nonprofit, very different than this very large group of people does not want to take this vaccine. Yeah. And so was it just about, I mean, I don't want to say it like letting them say their thoughts, but sorry, that's the rule, or what do you do?
I think listening to each other's perspectives is very important. And it's one thing that I try to remind people. I love working from home. I have worked from home for a very long time, long before the pandemic. I think most people are more productive at home on their tasks. But the difficulty is when we don't have those casual bumping into each other kind of conversations, the relationships become more brittle, and we forget. I think a lot of us have just forgotten how to kind of just normally interact with people. And so getting people together on Zoom is better than nothing, but in person is better. Zoom or whatever video platform. In person is better, and just hearing the different points of view. I also think it's really important for decision makers to just be as transparent as they can possibly be. And let people have input where there is room for that decision maker to bend according to people's input. Now, something like, do you have to get a vaccine in a federal office? The manager doesn't have any choice. I mean,
They have no
extremely
power.
little. Right, right. So it's explaining that and explaining, okay, here's what we can do. One group I worked with, actually, I actually facilitated a discussion about what should be the new rules about coming into the office or the workplace versus working from home.
Yeah.
And that turned out, they ended up pretty much where the manager had been prior to our meeting, which was 2 days a week. But through that 2 days a week in the office, when there's not like field work or something that like obviously has to be done in person. But a lot of good came from that discussion, which were things like one, for example, one person said, since we're not in the office as much, we should maybe be more intentional about how we use that face-to-face time to really maximize what we get out of it in terms of things like mentoring, building relationships through fun events, picnics, breakfast Fridays, or things like that intentionally work on relationships, through cross-training opportunities or shadowing, like opportunities to kind of follow somebody else around for a little while, see what their work is like. So there's cross-fertilization and learning across different functions. Yeah, yeah. So I think in terms of what can be done, it comes back to the old-fashioned stuff of just sharing perspectives, really listening, decision makers getting engagement where they can. And as a decision maker, you have to just be very clear, like, here's what's a non-negotiable, and here's where I am open to shifting what I do based on your input.
Very interesting. So there was another point that you made on the document that we have you fill out, and it kind of makes me laugh. The question of why are so many meetings so awful? So I completely acknowledge it. Like, what are we here for? What are we doing? Let's get in and out. What's the point? I try to do the chit chat. It can be painful for me, but that's my personality. And especially I work with half of my team. I have about 50 people in Mexico, where it's very, very critical. How are you? How was your weekend? How are the kids? And it's not that I don't want to know that. I'm just in work mode.
Right.
Yeah, I want to take everybody out to dinner and have a really good time and not talk about work at all. But in my meetings, I can get pretty, what are we doing? Let's get it done. So what is so awful that you're hearing about meetings?
Oh, and I've experienced them too, of course.
Okay, and your experience of these awful meetings. What is the definition of an awful meeting?
Yeah. And I want to remember to come back to cultural differences too, because we haven't really talked about that yet, for sure. And you gave a great example of how much do you just jump right into the task, which was the culture I came from on the East Coast, versus how much do you ease into it, build relationships first. And for the most part, most of the world is more relationship focused than like the big coastal cities of the United States. Yes. So but anyways, but let's come back to culture. But as far as awful meetings.
Yes, awful meetings.
We've all experienced it. It's not clear who's running the meeting, or there's a great conversation, but then everybody goes back to doing things the way they did before. So nothing really changed. Or a few people dominate and just sort of pontificate and take up all the airtime, and everybody else is rolling their eyes. All kinds of bad or it's nothing but sharing information that could have been shared in an email. That's another complaint I hear often from people who have to go to a lot of meetings. Like, just there maybe are a lot more meetings than there need to be. So a few basic, because keep in mind I do facilitation too. So I don't only deal with conflict, but it's
okay.
Providing the process. So when is it useful, first of all, to use a facilitator? It's when the process is huge or complex, or the issues are really tough, such that you want to separate out the leadership roles so that the actual decision maker, that leader, can be free of the process stuff, of worrying about the process stuff. So that's what a facilitator does, is worry about the process stuff.
Nice.
And so if you have a really big, gnarly, difficult meeting, that's when you might want to have a separate facilitator from whoever is leading the meeting. But a day-to-day meeting, staff meetings, small groups to tackle a particular issue, things like that, you don't typically need an outside facilitator. What you can do is just be mindful of a few basic tips to avoid some of the worst headaches about meetings. So one is, everybody thinks about an agenda and how important an agenda is. And yes, an agenda is important, but even more important than that, like an agenda will list the topics, right? But even more important than that is, well, what do you want to come away with on that topic? Do you want the group to come to a decision by consensus? Do you want the group to offer their thoughts and opinions and input that the decision maker will then take into account? Do you just want an exchange of views and just sort of reach better mutual understanding? Or do you just want to share information, just FYI? And so being clear on what that outcome is really important. Otherwise, you can be having two different meetings where one person thinks he's just sharing information and the other person thinks she's been asked for her opinion, and then they're at cross purposes. Be clear who's running the meeting. That seems pretty basic, but often everybody's talking and nobody knows who's actually running the meeting. Make sure to have someone track decisions or action items in writing.
Yes.
Ideally with names and timeframes attached, like who is going to do this and when is it going to be done by?
Yes, we did that last night. Yes, I actually had a meeting to say, I want to make sure we all have each of these on our calendar. And I want each, who's going to be doing what, by what time, when will we get it, who will approve, by what date. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And then make sure that's in writing so that everybody, and then circulate it. So that might just be an email, or it might be a somewhat more formal meeting summary or minutes. So that the most important thing is the decisions, action items, who's going to do what. And by when, ideally, and then circulate that in writing so that people have a chance to say, "Oh, that's not what I thought we decided."
Yeah.
And reconcile that before it creates a conflict later on. Let's see, what did I miss as far as basic tips for good meetings? Of course, consider whether a meeting is truly needed.
Absolutely.
Yeah, those are some of the big ones, and watch the time, and if it's a large meeting and there are a few dominant people, it might be worth it to do some breakout groups.
Mm-hmm.
But with breakout groups, you have to remember that you need quite a lot of time for breakout groups to report back to the full group. So just remember to kind of book enough time for that.
Very good. And then one of the last things that I always love to ask people, kind of a time to brag or show off, or just get excited, really. Telling me something that you're proud of that you or your company is doing this year or recently.
Yeah. So I'll talk about a couple of things because, first of all, I haven't talked yet about Pathfinders for Peace, the nonprofit I've been working on. And I was recruited by a Cameroonian who lives here in Colorado to, he's a professor. He's actually a prince from a kingdom in Cameroon, within Cameroon, called Nso, N-S-O. And he's also kind of a social entrepreneur. He's started a number of good projects or NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And so he thought, there's this conflict that started, it became a violent conflict in 2016, early 2017. It's a separatist conflict, the part of the country that was under British control for a while versus the larger part of the country that was under French control. So he recruited me and one other person, Porrick O'Malley, who's an Irishman in Massachusetts. And O'Malley was involved a lot in the Northern Ireland peace process, as well as some later work in Iraq. And he's written a number of books about different conflicts. So we formed a team and eventually a nonprofit organization, Pathfinders for Peace. And we've done some events in the US. It turns out that a lot of the separatist leaders are in exile, and many of them in the United States. So the diaspora community has been very important in this conflict. And we raised some money, which is why we had to form a nonprofit to be able to accept donations. We won't accept any money from either side, so nothing from the government of Cameroon or from separatist actors. So just foundations and individuals, interested individuals. And we've made 3 trips together to Cameroon. And so far, it's been a lot of what I would call quiet diplomacy. There have been other state actors, most recently the government of Canada, trying to facilitate or mediate. The terminology, both those terms have been used, and end to the conflict, but none has been successful yet. The most recent one kind of fell apart. And, we have the advantage that we're led by a Cameroonian. So where you've got that government hesitance to talk directly to non-state actors, it's maybe a little easier through us. So we haven't really done anything yet that brings together both sides, but we have been talking to both sides quite a lot, as well as civil society actors that are more in the middle. And that's really important to include in a peace process as well.
And that takes time for people to trust you and know you. You can't just go in, hey, I'm going to put these two, like, who are you? Right?
Exactly. And unlike in my business, I'm used to having a client, a scope of work, a contract, a budget.
You're invited in.
What's that?
You're invited in. You're asked to come.
Yes. Whereas in peacemaking, peace building work, especially as a non-governmental actor, you have to very gradually and at length earn people's trust. And so we've been working for a long time at that. And I think we have a lot of trust on a lot of sides. And so we're kind of looking at what's the next step? Is there something we can do that maybe is easier for us than for other actors for some reason? There are pros and cons to being a small, nimble NGO. Yeah. So pathfinders4peace.org, and the 4 is the number 4.
Yes.
Is
Pathfinders number 4
peace.org. Yeah, is our website.
That's
so I'm proud of that, even though there's nothing really super big and tangible yet that we can point to, like, hey, we got this agreement or something.
There's a goal.
Like that. Yes.
It just is going to take time. And you can't rush something like that as people get to know you.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think you put this in the teaser for today's show. I did some work in Sudan last year. That was for an agency that does development, but particularly political kinds of development in situations of political transition. And so this organization set up shop in Sudan after the old military dictatorship essentially was overthrown and there was a new civilian government. Unfortunately, the military clawed back control in October of 2021. And so at the time I was there, which was summer 2022, the military was in control, and this group was scrambling to figure out, okay, how can we, they had already kind of figured out how can we be useful. They were supporting a lot of civil society actors that were kind of pro-democracy, pro-peace, trying to support that element of society. And I wish more Americans understood just how amazing this pro-democracy movement is in Sudan. They've done huge nonviolent demonstrations in Khartoum and elsewhere. They are just so inspiring. And you might know women have been very, very prominent in the movement. The movement that overthrew Bashir, the former leader, as well as the ongoing democracy and peace movement. It's primarily a secular movement. It just these folks deserve our support. Yeah. And I just wish more people heard about them. So I wasn't working directly with the pro-peace or pro-democracy groups, But this was an organization that attracted people who were active in that movement to work for them. So most of the people I worked with were Sudanese who lived there. And at the time, there were negotiations going on, mediated or facilitated by this tripartite mechanism, which was the UN, the African Union, and a regional organization called IGAD, IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is a regional organization of sort of Eastern Horn of Africa area. So they were trying to get these talks going about would the military cede control back to a civilian government? Mm-hmm. And nobody knew where these were going to go. So a lot of what we did was scenario planning of, well, what would it look like if these negotiations were wildly successful? What would it look like if they fell apart completely? What would it look like if it's something mushy in the middle where, we're not really sure if we really want to support this, but we kind of want to. So these different scenarios. So it was basically a strategy session, and I co-facilitated with two other people, very brilliant, experienced people. So that was, and people walked away from that with, I think, just a lot more confidence that they were doing something useful, even though the environment was so uncertain and so rapidly changing. And one of the things they realized is that a lot of what they're doing would be worthwhile regardless of which of these scenarios played out. So what actually did play out after I left was they got this close to an agreement. I mean, really, really close to an agreement on a transition back to civilian rule. And in that agreement, the Rapid Support Forces, which is started out as a paramilitary group, but was kind of incorporated into the government, was looking at possibly having to cease to exist as a distinct entity and being folded into the Sudanese armed forces. And I guess they didn't like that. And so the current, it's more or less a war, the current armed action in Sudan is between those two armed actors, the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, and the more traditional military of Sudan.
My gosh.
And yet the people I worked with, they're safe. I've been delighted to learn. And they're kind of getting back to work. I don't know how they're managing it, but they're still at it, trying to support the positive elements of a political transition. Yeah.
Wow. I have learned a lot today. I did not know a lot about what was going in Sudan or Cameroon. I mean, I get my little clips of information. Hard to know a lot about everything. But thank you.
And by the way, I might add that the conflict in Cameroon is vastly underreported. I don't fully understand why. It just doesn't get a lot of coverage, sadly. So yeah, well, no surprise you hadn't heard much about it.
Yeah, we got to talk about it today. Suzanne, thank you so much for this time and for, kind of pulling aside the curtain of, I don't think a lot of us get to talk about what people are doing for conflict resolution and mediation and facilitation. As you said, it's not always mediation or just helping the meeting move along or the talk move along. So thank you so much for your time with us today.
It was so fun, Micah. Great to talk with you.
All right. And I will talk with you soon. And everybody out there, thank you so much for watching.